every single hand that you're playing in your range adds together to make the EV of your range. So you should play every hand the way it wants to be played. Yeah, there's going to be some exceptions, but there's an exception to every fucking rule that we can come up with in poker. But ultimately, adding up every individual hand is going to generate more EV for your entire range.
What's up, guys? This is the Carrot Poker Podcast, and we are back. We have a special guest today, Mr. Richard Shields, much more commonly known as GingePoker in the community. He's a Twitch streamer, he is a YouTuber, he is a 500 NL grinder, and currently residing and playing poker in Southeast Asia. Thailand, I believe, Richard, right?
Yeah, Thailand, Pattaya.
Nice. Welcome to the show. How's it going?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's good. It's like 3:30 here in Thailand in the afternoon, which is ironically when I've just woken up. So it's kind of like I've just moved around. Now I get up at a normal time in the UK, but it just happens to be 7 hours ahead in Thailand.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is like, it's just like an alien world because it's so like grey and cold outside, and I just had to like go out to the chickens and let them out and stamp on the duck's pond to make it thaw enough for them to swim in it, and then clean up dog sick. And then come up here in the dark and meet you, and then you're just like, yeah, Thailand restaurants are open, it's bright, it's not too hot, I'm in a t-shirt, but it's not, man, I'm envious. I'm envious.
Yeah, at night time now it's like 19 degrees with like a cold wind from the sea, so it's pretty cold and you might wear a hoodie sometimes.
That's just insulting. 19 degrees is pretty cold. I'm in Glasgow, if anyone doesn't know, and it's still pitch black. Well, it's starting to get light now, but yeah, fucking hell. Yeah, man, welcome and thank you for joining me. I want to talk about loads of stuff today. I mean, I'm sure you've got some interesting things to discuss from both the live and online environments. But, I mean, I guess you'd most commonly probably be known to people that I would work with as the Twitch streamer, as kind of the guy that... You're a bit of a rare breed because most 500 NL players who are sort of really experienced and solid and, you're obviously doing quite well are, these days, more on the secretive... keep themselves to themselves, kind of geeky, study for zillions of hours a day side. But you seem very, I don't know, just like more of the old breed of like having a laugh at the table, and you don't get too theoretical or detailed on stream like that. You just have fun with it, but you obviously play very well. Yeah, where do you feel that kind of style is fitting in these days, I guess, like in the modern climate where everyone's like busting their ass studying solvers for hours and hours?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, because obviously people have different perceptions of me. I've only got the one perception, which is this is how I play poker. I don't really see myself as like someone that has a laugh at the table, or someone that like deliberately has a laugh or deliberately doesn't talk theoretical. I just kind of do what comes natural to me type thing. And then some people are, oh, you see, like if you see me in a live world, they probably think I'm like a super solid, like not solid, maybe the wrong word. But if you see me in like a live world, they'll probably just think, oh, that's one of the online guys. And then if you see me in the online world, they go, oh, that's one of the live guys. So it's like, it's people's perception of me. As for like coming up in poker, I probably started more in the live scene. My mom and dad were both poker players, and I was sneaking into casinos when I was like 16, and then just grinding live there a lot. And then I switched to online, and then that was weird because I kind of did backwards with my friends. So like as I was switching to online, they were all switching to like live cash games, and I was a little bit jealous, to be honest, because they were probably making way more money than I was, and the games were a lot easier, but I just couldn't really afford to play live cash games. And then as I've moved up stakes, switching back to live, they're all kind of like, oh, we're not really good enough to beat the high stakes live, so we're going to try online again. And that kind of went full circle type thing. So I don't know. I guess I am a hybrid, but I don't know. I don't really see it like that, if that makes sense.
But it works because a lot of the time in the online Twitch community, you're trying to strike a balance, right, between people who understand poker, and you want them to be able, or I shouldn't say understand poker, like most people don't have a clue what's going on, but people who understand it to a good level, right? You're sort of studious online player, you're serious guy that's like committed, he's maybe getting a coach or whatever. And then you have like the general poker viewer who just wants to tune in and view somebody who's good at a game that they play recreationally. And I always found when I streamed for PokerStars last year that it was super weird for me because my normal audience is like run it once and like serious players and one-to-one coaching and stuff like that, and I'm very used to just being like in this spot, with our range is suffering here, we're going to check about 80% this handle bet more than average, blah blah blah, jargon. And I found that when I did that, a lot of people were just like, what the fuck's this guy talking about? Like, he's just talking nonsense. Like, he thinks he's good, but he's not. He just uses all these silly words and all of this. So I found it really hard to, like, appeal to both markets simultaneously. And I think, like, I have to say, I think you do a really great job of that. I think, like, the way you talk about the game is not, you're not simplifying or downplaying anything, but maybe you're not going into your full articulated thought process as it would be in your head. Maybe you are, I don't know. Like, do you deliberately like trim it back, or do you think you're just a very like intuitive player naturally?
It's definitely an element of both. I would say that from my experience in poker, I've just had experience with a lot of people that talk the talk but don't actually know what they're talking about, if that makes sense. And I'm really, really against that. I'm not sort of comparing myself to any other poker players, but like you'll have coaches and they'll like talk about, they'll say all these big jargon words, but when you kind of like trim the fat and try and actually understand what they're trying to say, they kind of start falling apart, and they just feel like and that for me is a massive pet hate.
Yep.
So I'm very big of like, I don't like to use words that, I don't like to use the bigger jargony words when I don't have to type thing. I'm very much, I try and approach it from like a the ground up and just really start from the simple side.
Yep.
And that really helps me understand some of the deeper concepts a little bit better too. If you kind of get down to like what do you actually mean when you say this. And that has helped my intuition, because you're thinking about less things. You're thinking about things in a more simpler way. It's a bit more coherent. You can see it more obviously when you get that stuff wrong. And I've kind of just built from there. So that's, I kind of hope that it answers your question, but I'm not necessarily doing it deliberately, but it's more just my approach to the game. And I coach some people sometimes, and they come to me and they start talking about like their check raise flop frequencies. And I'm just like, what are you talking about? What sizing should I make it here? And if you've got a good hand, make it as big as you can that he's still going to call a worse hand. And you've got a bad hand, make it as small as you need to, that he folds all the hands that are better. And they're going to meet in the middle somewhere. And it doesn't matter if you do it differently, because you're solving what you're trying to figure out at the time anyway. So when you kind of say that simple line of, use a sizing where he's going to still call a worse hand, use a sizing where he's going to fold a better hand, they might be different sometimes, but that's ultimately what a solver's doing as well. And if you don't need to skip to people skip to the solver stuff sometimes, whereas they should be using their brain a lot, in my opinion. And I feel like a lot of the online guys to an extent, some of the live guys switching to online just think that poker is this big beast where you need to get into solvers and you need to understand GTO and you need to understand frequencies. And I disagree with a lot of that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I do 90% agree with you. Like, I'm very much someone that will teach a student how to use a solver, but will make sure that I'm sat with them for like the first 2 hours they're doing it, so that when they're taking an output, they're not just like, oh, this hand is a 42% frequency or whatever. I'm more just like, okay, well, what is the overall heuristic or rule that we can take away here? Like, why does the solver raise second pair on this turn but not raise top pair on this turn, and also blah blah blah, and try and get across a concept to them, that when the hand is not a great call anymore, raise might become the same EV as call, because call is no longer that great when your showdown value diminishes, or whatever it may be, and try and get that concept instilled without trying to simultaneously adopt like a big grid of numbers and colors and shadings of boxes. I think it can be so detrimental, like you say. What do you think about this question, right? I get students a lot of the time, and one of my biggest pet peeves with taking on new students is when they're obsessed with their range in a way that is useless. So, and they don't understand the EV of their hand yet. They don't understand like the EV option that's best for them and why it's best for them with that hand. Yet they understand some really vague concept about their range. So an example would be, they c-bet the flop. I was talking to a student yesterday. He c-bets the flop on cash game, cutoff versus big blind, single raise pot. He's cut off. C-bets queen 6 deuce rainbow with 10-6 suited. Maybe he was button actually if he's opening that hand. And this is probably one of these spots, right, where checking is slightly more normal, and will be much better against certain players, but there might be some very passive, placid players that betting is a bit better against. And he bets against an unknown and say, yeah, you know, it's maybe not terrible, but check is the more standard play in GTO for X, Y, and Z reasons. And then we come to the turn, which is a queen, and he just bets the turn, like, straight away. And in this spot, like, people have reasons for betting that are to do with their range that are so bizarre, and it's something like, this card is good for, or maybe the turn is something else, this card is good for my range, so I bet. And it's almost like people are learning some range level shit and then replacing being able to play their hand with it. And it's really bizarre. So do you ever get that? Like, students that come to you and they've heard, like, this is good for my range, or this is bad for my range, and they just play every hand in some arbitrary way based on that. Like, how do you recalibrate that? Do you just have to talk to them about basics again and, like, what their hand wants to do?
Yeah, I do. I have experienced that. And the way I kind of look at it is there's two levels to it. There's like the macro level, which is your range, and there's the micro level, which is your individual hand.
The way you sliver, girl, sends shivers down my spine. One thought of you, damn, knocks me right out every time.
We interrupt this pod to bring you a very quick message. Guys, follow me on Twitch. It's carrot_corner. You can check out my channel on twitch.tv and see me live stream, see my student stream, see all kinds of educational and fun poker content. And also my solved ranges are currently for sale on carrotcorner.com. These are rake sensitive. They're tailored to the games that you play. Why not get yourself a complete set of pre-flop charts for the games that you play in? Now let's get back to the pod.
And I say to them, the way to make to generate the highest EV of your range is to play every single hand in that range at the highest EV possible.
Yep.
And then you're going to maximize the EV of your range.
Yep.
And then you try and take it from the, like, every single hand that you're playing in your range adds together to make the EV of your range. So you should play every hand the way it wants to be played. Yeah, there's going to be some exceptions, but, you know, there's an exception to every fucking rule that we can come up with in poker.
Right.
But ultimately, adding up every individual hand is going to generate more EV for your entire range. And that's some people look, because they look at it from the top down as opposed to the bottom up sometimes. It's just kind of like turning that around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think from the bottom up is great. And, like, I remember when I was writing my first book, like, back in 2015, it's very much a book for beginners by today's standards, the Grounder's Manual. But I was kind of thinking, like, do I do this from the top down or do I do this from the bottom up? And I remember having this deliberation, and I decided, like, if I do this from the top down, I might be wrong because I'm not that solid yet at all of this, and I might fuck it up, and I also might just alienate, like, a ton of people. And I'm really glad I did it from the bottom up, actually, because it just makes, like you say, so much more sense to see your range as just a combination of all of the EV of every hand. And what people need to understand is that a king on the river might be good for your range, but it doesn't turn third pair into a bet. It doesn't magically mean that when you bet third pair, something happens for you that's better than checking.
Exactly, yeah. And people do this with stats sort of too, like people that use a lot of HUDs.
Oh,
they
man.
see stuff like, they like, oh, but population folds a lot to bet, so I just I just bet 100% all the time.
It pains me.
Yeah, and I was like, well, yeah, we should be betting a lot, but that doesn't mean that we just get to bet everything now, and that's going to work out better just because population fold a lot. There's a reason population fold a lot, and if you actually think about what they're folding and you actually break down their natural folds, you can overbet. You can definitely start overbluffing in these spots. But to then just go ham with third pair because fuck it, bet.
And that's the key.
Make sense.
Overfolding, right? And if they're overfolding, some hands in your range, what people need to understand is that some hands in your range, i.e. garbage or gutter, become a better bet because fold equity is more abundant and those hands profit greatly. They have a big EV increase from gaining fold equity. But when you have Jack 7 on Jack 8-3 and your opponent folds tons to a C-bet, the EV of bet goes down.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So people like to sweepingly generalize, like, they fold too much, I range bet. And I'm like, well, if range bet is the best exploit you can come up with, if playing every hand in your range like a big solid block of shit that can only all play in a uniform way is the best way that you can exploit this weaker player, then something has gone very, very wrong. So this isn't the student's fault. In my mind, the student is very receptive and very sponge-like and very likely to admire and respect people that they pay tuition to listen to or, you know, subscribe to.
Yeah.
So this is more, would you agree this is more a problem with how people are teaching poker these days, with academia gone mad, and poker players are very intelligent, a lot of them. A lot of them are very strong intellectually, but they're not always socially or teaching-wise very aware. And I think that's sort of a trait that's ingrained into some very strong players, that they don't necessarily consider what it was like to be a newer player back then, and, you know, how you pitch ideas to someone of that level.
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest problems I have with education, or maybe more so with poker, is that certain people will teach things as fact when they don't fully understand them themselves. And then as someone who's receptive to learning, and you hear something, it's really difficult to get out of your head sometimes when you've learned something and you think that's true and it makes sense, and then get told it's wrong.
Yep.
And then have to like almost relearn something. That process is way harder. And there's a lot of that in poker. There's a lot of sort of like logical traps you can fall into in poker. Oh, that makes sense, but then it's not true.
Absolutely.
Or that makes sense, but there's actually a mistake here. And there's a lot of that. I don't just think it's like people necessarily teaching wrong, but it's just like when we thought this was the case years ago, until someone actually thought about it properly, and now we realize that's wrong. And then you see a lot of free content that's more older, that's going to be a bit behind.
Yeah.
And I think that people fall into a few of those traps with sort of like the way people learn certain things. And then also with poker, and this may be a bit more personal to different people, I find that most of the leaks I find in microstakes, like, I don't think microstakes, if I can say this, is super hard to beat. But the people that are struggling there are the people that not necessarily have the lack of poker knowledge. It's more something mentally that they're struggling with. And that can come along with being stubborn, and that can come along with like not willing to change their ideas, and not willing to sort of adapt to certain things, and like realize that they're, you know, poker's maybe more simple than they think it is. I think a lot of people that move up in poker make poker this giant, you know, everyone does this when they move up. They kind of like respect the stake too much. They're almost like, oh, but this guy's, you know, this is 200 zoom now, and I've just moved up from 100 zoom, and these guys are like way more capable here, so they're definitely gonna have all these bluffs here. And no, they don't. Like they don't have all these bluffs. You know, they're supposed to, maybe, if you look at a solver, but they still don't do that.
If it's so,
it's still the same game,
right? Yeah. If it's so counterintuitive to bluff on King Jack 10-8, like if you have to be bluffing every combo of sixes or something on some node, like it doesn't really matter who people are, right? They're not usually going to find that unless they're very strong. It's a bit like, I think it's a great point the way you put that. Like if I drink from this cup of coffee, I know you can't see my webcam, but I've got an empty coffee cup. If I drink from this, it's incredibly complex motion physically. Like if you were to plot out the physics of what I'm doing, you could draw insanely complex graphs about me drinking the coffee and every muscle moving in a certain way and every tendon contracting. But for me to successfully drink the coffee, how much of that process do I need to understand consciously?
Yeah,
I think it's like that with poker. There's so much going on behind the scenes. There is so much going on that affects EV, but there are enough easy, simple, broad strokes that are going on that are understandable that we should focus on them. And I think that's very much the way that you stream and the way that you teach, and I really like that. I think it's a skill that's lacking in the community in a major way. Going back to what you were saying before, what are some of the more common insufficient logic pieces or reasons that students pick up on some of this older bad content that they picked up years ago that they struggle to shake and they can't really get rid of? Are there common themes to that, like really common like bad thoughts that pollute people's thought processes?
I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head now. It's like one of those things that you like, as you see it, you deal with it. Like set mining was a thing for a long time. People still seem to think that's a thing, and it's not. It's just range on range and equity versus equity, and like doesn't like if you just have twos here and everyone else has eights plus, you're just going to be the guy that's set over set too much, and like, it's hard to break people out of that, because in theory set mining isn't really a GTO thing. But then again, if you're playing deep stack versus a whale and you do flop your set, maybe this is the time to maybe set mine becomes a thing again type thing. So it's hard to like quantify some of these particular sort of bad spots, as it were.
Yeah.
One of my pet peeves is something called minimum defense frequency, which so if you work out minimum defense frequency, it's just an equation to solve how often you should defend say button open during the big blind, you work out the price, you need to defend this much, otherwise you're not defending enough, etc. My first question to people when they bring up minimum defense frequency is, what did you call it the maximum defense frequency? Like, why is it called minimum? And they're like, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, well, first of all, that shows me you don't quite understand it. And second of all, it's just a frequency. If you do it too much or too little, you're doing it wrong. Like, so the fact that you called it minimum is already putting your mind in to say that I need to defend more than that. But that's not true. It's just that this is how much, in theory, you need to defend. If you do it too much, you're doing it wrong. If you're doing it too little, you're doing it wrong. But we just call it minimum for some reason. And, you know, that you call it minimum because you've learned it for someone that called it minimum. They haven't fully understood it either. And then it's now just become like this poker colloquial term that people quote sometimes to say that's why they did something bad.
Yep. MDF is a really... First off, it's also the name of like a type of wood, or the disposal site at the dump for certain bits of wood is called MDF, and every time I go to the dump to like throw away some old table or something, I see this MDF and I'm just like, lol, that's funny. Like, MDF. It's funny because it is a garbage term in many ways and it's used so badly. I think it's good for people to see that if they face a 3/4 pot turn bet and the guy isn't notably spewy, over bluffy, under bluffy, nitty, that trying to approximate about a 40% fold frequency and a 60% defense frequency with their range is probably solid if they do that in the right way. It probably equates to, like you said earlier, calling the hands that are plus EV to call and not calling too many of the ones that aren't. So that's okay. But absolutely great point about, I've never actually thought of this before. Why the fuck do we call it minimum when it's an exact number? Like, you know, if there's a right value to something, like if you're making a cake and it says use 800 grams minimum of flour, we don't say the minimum flour content, because if you put double that in, you're going to fuck it up badly. I think, well, let me ask you, maybe do we get fixated on minimum in poker because actually to some level we're all terrified of being bullied? We're all like still afraid of like the proverbial poker school bully that wants to make us fold too often and wants to be big and bad and run us over. Is that why we like seek out the minimum instead of the maximum?
I don't know, but you kind of hit on a more like mental gaming type point again, and that's interesting because that kind of relates to what I've been talking about getting on the micros. Because one of the biggest things you notice at sort of high stakes, especially high stakes live, is that ego is kind of really taken out of the game. And like that fear of being bullied is not really a thing. It's like, so the best example I can give of that is if you do play high stakes live, especially when you get to like the super high stakes where it's not necessarily about, because I find like if you go and let's say like 5-10, 10-20 in LA or Vegas, it's still a lot of like bad reg versus bad reg stuff, and there's a lot more ego and it's a lot more competition. But if you get to like 100, 200 live, it's more, okay, everyone here has made it here. No one's drastically better or worse than anyone else. They might be slightly better at certain spots or slightly worse at certain spots. But we're all just here because there's Wales playing and we're just all hoping to get him. And there's a lot more camaraderie, and the ego is just sort of almost taken out of the game. And that's really cool because the ego is something that I feel like you have to work on in poker. I feel like ego is what makes you want to win at poker and get you into poker, but then your ego is the thing that you don't have to deal with to get good at poker. And it's like, it's, you know, he's allowed to bully you and you're allowed to bully people, and you know what I mean? Like, it's not like you shouldn't go after someone because he's doing something more. You should just focus on playing good and good things will happen type thing. But yeah, I do think that probably does come into a lot more of the low stakes stuff. Yeah.
I think the term reg battles is like a nonsense from years ago, where before GTO, before solvers, before anyone really figured out like what frequencies were actually solid and what weren't, people were 4-bet bluffing all of their range because it's the first time I got 3-bet this session, and it was all this weird, like, I don't know if you remember those things, like all these weird metagame rules that came, and they were always in the direction of aggression, and at one point it was extremely unfashionable to check or to call, and everything was just bet, don't pay it off, bet, fold, and bet, fold if in doubt. And I mean, bet, fold is like, it has its place, but if you look at a solver, or you look at like the true essence of poker, bet, fold is not as much of a thing as people used to think it was, and that probably plays into this concept of initiative and like all the connotations that came from that. So I guess my point here, I'm kind of rambling, but my point here is that I think a lot of the technical leaks and a lot of the mental leaks that people have are interwound. They're not just like separate things, like the technical justify the mental and vice versa. I want to talk more about these live games for a second though. What kind of, obviously, did you choose to move out to Southeast Asia in order to pursue like the live poker scene? Was that the fundamental reason behind it?
No, I was still like a 100 Zoom grinder when I first came over to Thailand, and I was just, it's cheaper than living in the UK. It's a bit more of a fun lifestyle. So, living in the UK, probably paying like £400-500 in rent plus bills, etc. Whereas could do that in Thailand, and it's not like I had a job. So,
Right.
I'm working on my computer. So, and I had friends here, and then just slowly grinded up the limits from there, and then ended up going to Macau because it's like 2.5 hours from Thailand on a flight.
Yeah.
And then did a trip where I sort of was feeling it out, shot taking a little bit, and then went back again, grinded a bit more, did quite well, and then went back again and just sort of every time I went for longer type thing.
Cool. Did you make some contacts within that field and end up being able to play some of the more private games, higher stakes games with whales in them and things like that?
It's very racist in Macau. Like white guys are very, very tough to get into the private games there. It's almost like an anti-white guy game where they don't like playing in the local casinos because the Chinese guys or the whales will just come and lose every time, right?
Yeah.
Because the regs are going to destroy them. Whereas if they play with some more like bad local regs, they feel like they're having a bit more of an experience and they can speak their own language and they can have a bit more fun.
Yeah.
So the only way I could possibly get into a live game is source in my YouTube channel.
Wow. That's crazy to think about, yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny. And I'd imagine that like what is the furthest away thing from like looking as if you're Chinese, probably being GingePoker, right? Having the ginger beard and everything.
I mean, it's kind of cool seeing some guys like comment on some of my videos from like Hong Kong and China. I'm like, oh, cool. Any chance of a private game?
Nice. So what kind of stuff were you playing in the live scene over there then? Was it all cash? And what's the sort of highest stake game that you frequented?
All cash. The VIP seat. So the way it works in Macau is it's all normal cash games. 100, I think 10, 20 is minus 5-10, but I think 10, 20 pound is the minimum stake usually. And then the first game with a VIP seat. So by VIP seat, I mean they have an empty seat or potentially two empty seats where no one can sit down but it's reserved for basically if a VIP walks in, and the floor kind of know who the VIPs are / will decide if someone's a VIP. But regs are on the list and they only get the first 8 seats type thing. So the lowest stake for that is £30, £60. And then, so basically what happens is you pay £30, £60. To be fair, I think that game is actually beatable, even with regs, because the regs, Macau's a weird bubble where the live players there are rich enough to be able to play the stakes because they've been there either for years or they've grinded other places live, but they probably couldn't beat 500 Zoom. So obviously rake's a factor and it's live, so there's other factors too, but I reckon you probably, a good 500 Zoom player is still winning in that game at like more than one big blind per hour without the VIP, which is sick. So I'm just like, okay, I've only got X amount of action, but it's still a £60 big blind, so it's still like a reasonable hourly.
Yeah. And
then what happens is when a VIP sits down, the straddle instantly goes on. So you're probably winning at like somewhere between 1 and 3 big blinds when there's no VIP. And then when a VIP sits down, the stakes get doubled. Well, more than double technically because they're third blind, and your win rate just goes from 1 or 2 big blinds to like 7 to 10 big blinds.
So sick.
Yeah. And then the 1K, 2K game, which is a £100, £200 game, is like the next stake. So that's, you could say that's almost 3x, but realistically it doesn't get straddled as much. So it's only just like bigger than the straddle game by like 40% or whatever. And then that game probably doesn't run as often. That game runs like way more infrequently. Might run a lot during like Chinese New Year or something. But then basically, so I mainly played the 30-60 game, but then obviously when it was good, it was straddled. And what you'll find is that when a VIP's in town, he might play like every day. So then you're just like grinding all the time, like you're just playing all your hours. So for example, you might have the list reset to 6 o'clock in the morning. So you turn up at 6, you join the list. If there's enough people to start the game, we'll start the game at 6 o'clock in the morning and you have to play, otherwise you ain't in your seat. Then you grind until maybe like midday with these regs, hoping the VIP turns up. The VIP turns up, plays for 2 hours, leaves his chips there, goes for dinner, comes back, plays another 3 hours. Maybe he goes away, maybe he doesn't play again, maybe he loses money, maybe he doubles up, maybe he leaves. But basically then you end up playing about 20 hours, but getting like 5 hours with the VIP. Obviously, it varies day by day. And then maybe you'll do that for like 5 days in a row or like 3 days in a row, and then you're like fucking done for like 2 days.
Yeah.
And redo it again. So it's not good for your health, but that's kind of just what you have to do.
That's poker, though. I mean, if you want to like maximize your EV, you've got to live in a little bit of a weird schedule. You can't just rock up to 500 Zoom at 9 o'clock a.m. UK time and grind all day with like some of the best fucking players in the world. Going back to what you were saying about that game, it's actually the highest convenient game that runs in the world, and it's probably the toughest convenient game that regularly runs in the world. And you have people like Ben Sulsky playing in that game. You have like all kinds of like famous, and not just famous for being celebrity or for being sponsored, but famous for being like sick good at poker people in that game. So I would agree. I think if you can beat 500 Zoom over like a large reliable sample, and you've got a good mental game, you can probably beat any live game in the world, barring, you know, the toughest lineup that could be engineered. Going back to
and that's the kind of thing with live as well. The games, it's almost like if I could get in a high stakes game now, and even if it was with like Limitless, Solsky, True Teller, the reason the game is running is because they'd be a VIP.
Yeah.
So as much as those guys are maybe better than me, they're not significantly better than me enough that I wouldn't be winning in the game because the VIP would be so bad type thing.
Right. It's a bit like in the solar system, there's like some distance between like fucking Mercury and Venus and Earth, but then like Jupiter's like miles away suddenly, right? Or like these other planets. Yeah. And that's what it's like with the VIP, right? The gulf in skill between a fish and a bad reg will always be much bigger than that between a bad reg and a good reg. And people...
Yeah, I mean, when you find a whale, you're just like, okay. And you're playing like, I don't know, imagine a high stakes game like that would be like 1,000, 2,000 blinds or something stupid like that. You're like, it doesn't even matter if I'm making one big blind in this game, it's £2,000.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could even have, if you're on a table that's very, very good, you could even have double digit win rates or something like that if the players are bad enough. It's an exponential curve, right? A whale...
I was going to say, then the other politics in Macau becomes about which seat you get.
Yeah.
Because obviously there's a VIP seat, so you know where the VIP is going to sit. Sometimes there's two, so it's 50-50, but like getting that seat on the direct left versus getting the seat on his direct right, the EV swing there, we were always debating like, oh, is it so much, like it obviously is better, but how much better is it? Like, would you pay for the seat type thing? And that's for example, if you get the Jesus seat, as we call it, in a game, even if Limitless is behind me and Ben Solsky's behind me, I'm taking that seat all day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people need to understand that, like regs that are grinding out. Here's another question, right? I'll kind of like swing to a completely opposite end of the poker spectrum for a bit, and I'll swing back in a minute to live high stake nosebleeds. But someone that's grinding, like a lot of my students come to me and they're playing 10 and L, or they're playing 25 and L, or a game like this. And one of the things I usually stress to them is like, you should spend as little time in this game as possible. The rake is cripplingly big. The rake cap at 10 and L is like 15 BB per 100. In a 6 max game, it can be. So oftentimes there, when you're playing at unfavorable sites and unfavorable times of the day, and you're sitting down with 5 regs who are also grinding 25 and L, and you're a little bit better than those regs, you're still not going to beat the game at all. You're nowhere near, because the reg, even if you're a lot better than those regs in reg versus reg speak, you're still not going to beat the game because the rake is 8 BB per 100, and you're not going to be 8 BB per 100 better than these guys. So what would your advice be to someone these days that's starting out in poker, doesn't have a big bankroll, and wants to make money from the game? Like, that's actually their ambition. How do they go about it?
I mean, it's tough. I mean, they've got to obviously shot take very, very aggressively. That just makes a lot of sense, right? Even if you got like 10 buy-ins, like you take your one buy-in shot, right? You need to get out of the micros as fast as possible.
Yep.
I mean, but you know, when we're talking about $100, $250, $500 bankrolls, like the first thing I say to people is like, get a job and save some money so that you can shot take even higher. Like if poker might be a little bit too slow to get out of 25, like maybe you do need to go work and save some money for 2 months and then try 50. And like, obviously you can still be grinding 10 an hour and 25 an hour for practice, but don't be disheartened if you're losing at a small win rate to still try 50. And sometimes as well, from my experience, shot taking the high limit is some of the best lessons you can have.
Yep.
Like when I was moving from 200 to 500 and I used to get my ass handed to me at 500, those are the best lessons. Those are like, I remember there was a certain spot where I was bluffing, and then everyone would just call me all the time, and it was like double flush draw, and I would just bet river, and I was like, fuck, like they always call me, like, what the fuck do I do? And then I had the spot the way around at 500, and I was like, okay, oh sick, now I get to call him, like this is gonna be great. I could finally do this bluff catch that everyone keeps doing to me, and then he like 5x pots or 3x pots, like fuck, I don't know how to do it. What the fuck do I do now?
Right.
And all of a sudden, like the whole, oh fuck, I could get 3x pot in this spot, and that's sick.
It's a eureka moment. It's an epiphany.
Yeah, exactly. And like you don't get that as much when you get comfortable in the stake, was moving up and challenging yourself. And one of the biggest things for me in improving at poker is being super self-critical. Like a lot of people, and I find this a lot with my academy, and with working with performance guys, is they look for answers that are outside of themselves.
Yeah.
Like they look for like, oh, I need to use a solver, or I need to do this, or I need to learn this, or I need this coach. Like you need to be accountable for your own poker journey. Like forget solvers, at least for now. Like you've got to be the one that goes through your hands and goes, could I got away from that? Could I made more money here? You've got to have that skill, because that's like a skill that will never ever go away and will improve. And that's what you need to do. You need to get into this cycle of continuous improvement. And if you're not doing that for yourself, you're not going to get anywhere, I don't think.
But not to, totally agree, but not too religiously in every single spot, right? There's also such a thing in my experience as a student, becoming obsessed with the notion that one line is always much better than another, and obsessed with the notion that they're making mistakes all over the place. So you'll get a guy, the flop will come up and it'll be like, I don't know, ace, queen, 5, and he'll have like ace, jack on the flop against some unknown reg, and then he'll start being like, oh, I don't know why I did this on the flop. I'm like, look, man, like whatever you do in the flop here, it's really not going to make a big difference, like against this guy. Like you have a tier 2 hand, you have a hand that's not trying to build gigantic pots on that many runouts. You know, you can check, you can bet big, you can bet small. Nothing bad is going to happen to you here. Let's get to something that really affects your EV. And then you get the guy that's on the other end of that, who's just like, yeah, favourable for range 1/3, and just doesn't want to explore anything at all, and it's like completely in the other direction. So it's kind of fascinating, that balance that you have to strike there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what poker is really about when you start moving up as well. It's like, it's not like Masher Dog or Limitless are playing drastically different to, say, some of the 500 Zoom regs. It's just that they're more refined, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like people ask me like, what's the biggest thing you see at high stakes compared to low stakes? So I'm like, well, when I'm playing small blind versus big blind, I know that Masher Dog isn't going to make a mistake.
Yeah.
And he's going to beat me at X amount of big blinds, whereas I'm playing against 25 and L guys, they're going to be doing stuff all over the shop that's going to give me free money, but Mashed Up just isn't giving me any of that.
Yeah. A lot of the money we earn in poker, right, we reap it passively. We kind of wait for our opponent to do something silly. Like, for example, and one of the things we should be saying to our students, and I'm sure that you do this, is, okay, you've got these two lines and Pio mixes, and whenever Pio mixes, clearly there's no EV difference because it's not going to sacrifice its own EV for the sake of range neatness. That's another pet peeve of mine, when people think that because it does something 80% of the time that it's much better. Yeah, sure, let's shoot myself in the foot 20% of the time just for fun. No, it doesn't do that. But say it's mixing and people are like, okay, is it better to bet this turn or check this turn with this flush draw? I feel like what they then need to do is consider which line their opponent is going to misplay against the most. Like, so if they bet 3/4 pot, what are the odds their opponent's going to make a big mistake there at 25 and L? Not that high, right? Because a 25 and L player sees that spot all the time. What's the sizing he encounters the most? It's going to be 3/4 pot, because that's what mindless zombies at 25 and L do. The guys that have been stuck there for years just click the button they've always clicked. If you overbet, there's a very high chance he'll do something wrong, or he'll be inaccurate, or he'll call the wrong types of hands with the wrong blockers, or something like that. So I'm always kind of saying to people, think about what people are going to mess up the most against. And like my favourite example of that is, villain's a fish, you have top pair, it's not a great top pair, or you have second pair or something, you're on the flop. If you bet, you make him split his range, right? And he will probably do that in some reasonable way. If you check, though, on a board that's really favourable for you, like ace, queen, deuce, rainbow, and you check back, how often is he meant to bet 10-9 on the turn with no draw? And they'll say, I don't know. They'll say, well, he's never meant to bet 10-9 because he's at big range disadvantage. He's not allowed to ever bet 10-9. If he bets at 10% of the time, he blunders. Now, what percentage of fish bet 10-9? I don't know. 25% of them bet 10-9? That's more than double the... That's infinitely more than the frequency they're allowed to. So if you can make somebody deviate to a point where they're screwing themselves over and you're never folding, you need to do that. Like, earning money from poker is not just about an instant reward. It's not just about, I make him fold on that street and I feel good because I get the pot. It's about planning out the hand and thinking about which future nodes earn you the most, right? And we need to get people to think more about that.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with what you said.
I think it is so hard these days to get into the game, and people might feel squeamish about that approach you recommended, right? I agree with it, but I think people will feel like, oh, a 10 buy-in shot, there's just too much variance for that. Like, what would you say to someone that just wants to safely and steadily beat 5 NL, beat 10 NL, beat 25 NL, and grind their way up from 0 to hero?
I mean, I wouldn't have ambitions of that because, like, there's so many, like, grinding 5 NL is so different to grinding 100 NL, which is really where you probably want to be before you think about going full time, right?
Yeah.
Maybe 50. But, like, 5 NL is just almost a different game, I'd say. I would imagine, at least. I haven't obviously played 5 NL in a while. But it's not teaching you, like, about poker that much at, like, the level that you want to play at. It's almost a waste of time, I would say. But yeah, practice and get used to ranges and softwares and all that kind of stuff. Like, we've all done that, right? Go with 2 and now just to make sure our stars caption and all our HUDs are working and do that stuff. But to learn poker and to improve, it just doesn't feel like it's the right place to be. And it depends what your ambition is. Obviously, if you enjoy poker, it's completely different. Like, play what you can afford. But if you're trying to be the best player you can be and making money and turn pro, I think it's almost a waste of time. And maybe that sounds harsh, but I really do think that, like, you want to really be starting probably at 10 and out, and you need to be getting out of it. Like, yeah, it's an aggressive shot take, but if you've got a job, like, come back in 2 months. Like, it's still going to be more beneficial, I think, than grinding 10 and up or 5 and up.
Do you think that people, through having an overly safe bankroll management strategy, actually make themselves not used to variance? They become too sensitive to variance because they're trying to avoid it too much? Should people just be embracing the natural gambly swingy side of this game more?
I'm not sure. I think that there's something to be said for, say, not being super high variance and then potentially looking for some sort of staking deal. Like, if you're being 25 and now for, like, a few big blinds, and then you can get staking for 50, and then your win rate isn't necessarily going to half because 50 isn't twice as hard, and maybe the rate benefits mean that you, instead of going from 3 big blinds, you go to 2 big blinds or whatever. Like, there's something to be said for that. And then grinding it out and keeping that low variance, and then slowly grinding it that way. But then you need to build the contacts, and you need to, like, no backer's going to begrudge you shot taking 50 so much to get out the micros. They're going to, their backers are pretty sensible, smart people who look at things fairly analytically, and they see you crushing 25 and then shot taking 50 and it going badly, and they think they can help you a little bit as well. You're still going to be a good candidate for staking. So I don't know. It's interesting because for me, I jumped in straight at 100. Like, I couldn't afford to. I had like 6 blinds. But, like, that was just me moving from live poker to online poker and sort of taking my chances, and then slowly, having to move up and down. Okay, I lost 2 blinds, I'll play 50. Okay, I'll play 100 again. And then slowly spinning up from there. Once I had 2K, I was like, oh, that's it. I'm 100 soon grinder. And then, but that was me. And obviously I ran good, and obviously, like, I had experience before that for live poker, and I don't think I was losing at 100 straight away. I probably was breaking even at first, and then through like my own sort of being self-critical, increase my win rate, etc. But it's different for everyone. It's hard for me to relate because everyone goes on a different journey and everyone starts at different levels and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like I've done the 5 and now grind up. Maybe it is possible, but to me, it doesn't sound like the most efficient, best thing to do.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's possible. I think it's possible if for some reason, despite having a full-time job and a family, like, I'm kind of talking about one particular type of student here, a guy that's got all these commitments. He doesn't have that much time for poker. He loves the game. He fucking loves it. He wants to make it in poker and make a side hustle and just be, like, proud of himself in poker. And that's a good, reasonable expectation. But with 8 hours a week for the game, you cannot possibly play 10 and L if you have those goals. It's completely inconsistent with those goals. I think what you have to do is, even if you go away and study a bit and then invest, like, make money while studying, just don't play for a little bit for a couple of months, and then build up your skills, and then take a plunge, have a you're always going to be vulnerable to variance. There's no way in poker that if you're playing up, like the highest EV moving up the stakes, trying to make it strategy will always incur some level of risk that the average human's not comfortable with. And I think if people can accept that sooner, they have a better chance of succeeding.
Absolutely. But equally, on the balance side, again, we're always talking about balance here. There are students that are studying so much. Like, you get the 25 and now guys that he goes, yeah, I've been doing Berlin versus Big Blind for the last 3 months, and I'm going to jump back in at 25 and now. So I'm like, you must get that as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm just going to study under the gun versus hijack 3-bet pot for 4 months because it'll teach me about how to play 3-bet pots. It's just like, no, like, you need to play as well, right? You've got to get versed in being bombarded with common spots and get good at solving them in 15 seconds. The other thing I get is a guy that writes up 6 pages about a hand and tries to put his opponents on some exact range combo by combo and then tells me how his opponent's range is exactly contracting when he bets. And it's like, this is the biggest waste of time I've ever fucking seen. Like, it's teaching you that poker's this dissertation when actually a hand occurs within 10 seconds. What can we say about that? Like, developing that reflex that allows you to react quickly in poker. How do you hone that while at the same time not just becoming wrong or illogical?
Well, I think this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately because so sort of I guess you call it the Charlie Corral approach, where you kind of trying to use a bit more of your intuition and kind of like allowing yourself to not gut react to things, but trusting your gut a little bit more as well.
Yep.
And so for me, it comes from, like, if we can get a little deep for a second, like, I feel like if you feel an emotion, like, there's a logic behind it.
Yep.
And like, not that intuition's an emotion, but it comes from somewhere, right?
Yep.
And it could be just trusting the fact that you've got all these logics behind that you kind of like reflexed in now, or it could just be like, fuck, I want to call. And like, I feel like as you get more experience, you kind of start to recognize the two, because you go through, at least I did, go through like a learning phase where I'm like, right, I just need to fucking start following rivers, even though I want to call, and I'm fighting that, even though it's not really an intuition, it's more like an urge where we're all stubborn and we want to call these rivers and we want to see what they've got. And like, you've got, then once you kind of get into this intuition phase, you're like, is it this thing where I just want to call, or is it actually me going, I don't believe this, and there's a reason for it that I haven't quite figured out yet? And talking out loud really helped with that. And I guess streaming kind of like, I'm talking out loud all the time. But also understanding the game from a first principles approach, which is like really how I try and approach it. As long as all that logic's in the right place, you go, oh, I think you should do this, blah, blah, blah. Oh, this doesn't quite make sense. Like, one of the biggest things at Foreign and Zoom I found when I first moved up was if you play your range, quote unquote, wrong, like if you make a mistake with like a sizing, or you make a mistake with like over bluffing, or like certain spots where, so Foreign and Zoom range is like pretty obvious because they understand that this, you shouldn't bluff too much here, or you're going to over bluff here and you didn't over bet, so they're just going to call half pot sizes. And I got punished quite significantly with that when I was moving up, and that's where I kind of learned. So now I'm always thinking about, how does my range want to play, what sizing do I want to make it, if I do this, what sizing do I want to do, to the point where if someone does it wrong, it may be more subtle nowadays, but because I'm always in that kind of like using my brain to think about this stuff, there'll be every now and again I go, this doesn't make sense. But then sometimes the problem with that is that not everyone plays the same style or the same strategies that you do, and they may have made a mistake earlier in the hand that meant they have now a good hand here when they shouldn't. So there's still, it's never going to be a full science. But I find that if I were in Zoom, that's kind of a cool thing about getting used to the limits, because you get used to like how population plays, so you can make more of these like almost aggressive assumptions, and then kind of like play back at them. But I guess that has to be intuition, because that to me is what poker is. When you get to a certain level of like, he's doing this, you're doing that, but you're not sure, but could he do this, could he do that, and you gotta work it out on the fly. That, you know, using all your judgment and all the stuff that you've learned so far in poker to actually make a decision, that's what poker comes down to, and that's what I think we're really doing when we're playing poker.
And there doesn't have to be anything necessarily spooky or spiritual or sixth sensey about that. It can, you know, if we're talking about the Charlie Carroll road, we don't have to fully become Charlie Carroll. We don't have to commit to like the extreme end of that spectrum. That it's possible to take more of a sports psychology angle on it as well, right? So if you're looking at this being like, I don't like his content, he talks about blah blah blah, we're not saying like we're going to go that far. We're just saying that logically speaking, in the brain, there are all these synapses and all these neural pathways firing all the time, and the more you work on something, the more they fire. And sometimes they fire without cognition, without conscious thought following that or tracing it. And therefore, like, even in a game like chess, I don't know if you ever play chess or other gambling games. Do you like more just poker, or do you dabble in other things?
Mainly just poker, but I play a lot of different card games.
Right. So in all card games, all logic games, all games like chess, there's, like, I'll look at a chess position sometimes, and I'm not an amazing chess player, but I'm like fairly solid, and I'll look at a chess position and my brain will just go, this is the right move. You need to play, like, bishop takes f6 here. And then I'll be like, right, well, let me stop and calculate why that is. And then I'll do the calculation. I'll be like, oh, yeah, I can see some good things happening here. I do see why my brain liked that. So I'm kind of like being told what to do by my intuition. And then I'm kind of like,
check it.
I've got to check it out, yeah, because it might just be some false positive from a similar position. It's actually subtly different. And that's the same in poker, right? Like, the guy over bluffs for 3/4 pot because all these draws Messi calls a small c-bet. You leave his range unfiltered, you leave it wide. The turn bricks, the river bricks, and he's got 84 combos of missed gutter just waiting there for a start. Then he bets half fucking pot because he's a fish, and you need 25% equity, and he can only be bluffing 25% of the time. It sounds like this is what happened to you when you initially took, right? You overloaded bluffs into your range for too small of a sizing. Of course, as you said, if you overbet, you get to bluff more. That's a really good point. But the point would be here, like, in poker, your intuition will reach a point where it will go, you need to call this bet because this is overbluffed. But then you've got to check it out, because actually, if that guy filtered his range in some way earlier that you're then forgetting about, like he called a flop raise or something, it may well be that many of those hands don't exist like they normally would. So you do have to verify it, right? You have to go for it and make sure.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the time. I don't know if you watched on my streams where I'm like, guys, I think I'm going to call this. That's usually me just going, I'm checking it through in my head. And there's a little bit of extra checks on the screen because I don't want to look stupid as well. I don't want to make some ridiculous. Well, obviously, you've always got. You're going to get that in the chat every time you get it wrong anyway. Yeah. They're always like, oh, well, obviously you had that. Everyone knew you had tricks there. But like, it is cool. But like, obviously, I don't get it right every time. But then I was talking to Pads about this, and Pads was like, yeah, it's sick that you can do that, and it's sick that, like, he goes, you should trust him more, and not say like, I could get wrong here, guys, because it doesn't matter if you get wrong, because you know the amount of times that I've got it right. For example, let's say I get let's say I do 2 out of 10 wrong. It doesn't matter because I'm still printing in the spot.
Two out of 10, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if you're allowed to think like this and sometimes get it wrong, as long as you kind of keep that in check too. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions that was written in my Discord group was, do you think streaming improves your game, or do you play better when you're streaming than when you're not streaming? I think you've kind of answered the first part, but what about the second part? Like, do you play better when you're having to articulate to an audience, or when you're on your own and not being watched?
I would probably say there's elements to both, depending on different, obviously the game's multifaceted. So there's stuff, how do I say this on a podcast? There's stuff you can do off stream that you can't do on stream. Like some people might stick charts on their around them and stuff, but obviously I can't do any of that. Right. Which obviously is much easier when you're playing like high stakes, just to know all your ranges. But I have to learn mine off by heart. Yep. And then just check to see how I did pre-flop. And then but then talking out loud is something that I think that's a good exercise to do anyway when you're playing poker. So that I'm used to doing, and that I would not necessarily do it out loud when I'm playing off stream, but I do it sort of in my own head. And I would probably play slightly better off stream, but not significantly so. The main annoying thing on stream is like I may occasionally misclick because I'm typing to chat and then press enter, and all of a sudden I 3-bet 90 off. And there's some timeout spots. So I'd probably play slightly worse, I would say, on stream, but more because of the physicalities of streaming, not necessarily because of any like mental...
the mechanical errors. Yeah, it's definitely a big thing. Yeah, for sure. Cool. So a couple of other questions just to finish off with then. Let's talk a little bit more about the live scene, because we've talked a ton about like what people should do online, grinding your way up, like fighting through your career, and that's all awesome stuff that people want to hear, and I think they'll love listening to this interview. But what about like the other end of the spectrum? Like when you started playing these really high stakes games, was there ever a time when the money just got to you? Like, did you ever feel your mental game starting to take a hit because you were just playing such huge pots?
So I got some interesting stories about this, but I feel like I'm a bit of a psychopath. Probably helped that I was grinding stars in like big blinds only for a long time with stars catching. I don't do it anymore for the stream, but I used to always grind in big blinds only. So you kind of become a little like you kind of trained yourself a little bit to become immune to the sticks. I don't know if you do that as well.
Yeah.
But like, so like I don't know. So like when I used to grind all the time, I didn't know whether I was playing 200 or 100 or 500. Like,
Yeah.
obviously I knew before the session, but if I was multi-tabling, it wouldn't matter. So moving to live, I just tried to see everything in big blinds, and it helped that it was a foreign currency. So, for example, it's in Hong Kong dollars, so that I'm not playing in pounds. I'm playing in Hong Kong dollars. So then it kind of seemed a bit more like Monopoly money, and you didn't really think about it as much because you'd have to do the conversion to work it out. That being said, so I'm very much of the I'm just going to play good, and what happens happens, and that's just how I play poker. Whereas someone that was not backing me but was taking a piece of my action was probably under-rolled at the time, let's say, to take the piece. And the game became like a 1K, 2K, 4K game, which is a £100, £200, £400 game with 2 VIPs.
Wow.
And I'm sat there with my £20,000, which I think I dusted a little bit. So I was in for like 3 buy-ins. And then I think I spanned it back up to like 80K. So I'm up small. Yeah. And then this pot happens where so many things happen in this hand. But it goes like VIP opens, reg 3 bets off like 40K, which is basically 100 bigs for this game with the straddle. VIP cold calls the 3 bet. I'm in the big blind or the small blind, not the straddle, with ace king off. And I 4 bet. And I'm about 100. So I'm about 100K deep now. All the VIPs are about 100K deep. So but the reg is like 100 bigs deep. And so I don't want to 4 bet massive and have the reg already jam on me with good hands or never or whatever. So I make it like £9,000 here. The first VIP folds, the reg folds, and then the second VIP calls. And then we get like deuce 3 or deuce 7 flop.
And you are 100K like you're like 3 stacks. Or 2.5 stacks deep with this guy.
2.5 stacks deep,
right.
Yeah. 2.5 stacks deep, but it's a cold 4 bet, cold call 3 bet pot. So like SPR is a bit more like it's a 150 bigs, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I see bet 7 deuce, turns a 3, which gave me a backdoor flush draw blocker on the king, and I decided to barrel. And then the river was a deuce, and I'm like, well, get some jamming. For like I think I jammed like 80 into 90K on the river, or something like 90 into 100. I can't remember the exact figures, but I remember the pot being about 230K, and he tanks for what seems like eternity, but is actually like 20-30 seconds, and then folds.
Right.
And I'm like fucking shaking at this point. The pot's fucking right. And
what do you feel like in that 20-30 seconds? What's going through your head, and how are you trying to mask that then? Are you giving that away? Do you feel like you're exuding that sort of terror, or like how do you manage your...
It's interesting because I feel like I'd have the same excitement if I had aces thinking, but it'd just be the opposite. I'd be like, he's going to call, he's going to fucking call, it's a massive pot.
Yeah.
Because I've had the spot the other way around too, where I've had it. And like he folds fairly quickly. You probably seem longer of a head, but fairly quickly. And I was fairly confident because he didn't 4-bet pre, he doesn't have queens plus, and I felt like he was basically folding range on this river. Because my read on the guy, he was up money, he didn't want to go down.
Yeah.
Like, that's the type of VIP that he was. He wasn't like the station VIP.
Yeah.
So I feel like he's folding jacks at least half.
Yeah.
Always folding.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, I don't want to put him in an exact range here, but that's pretty much what I thought he had.
And live, you can kind of do that a bit more, right? For someone that's playing... Like, I have students who play 25 and L to, again, just show this dichotomy, right, between the two worlds. And they might say something like, I put him on a flush draw. Or something absurd that they can never do, right? And it's like, you hear people playing against people they play against all the time. You hear people with, like, really good live reads. You hear people that are, like, been playing a 12-hour session with a guy and have a read like that. You just don't get to say that about a guy just because his HUD is blah, blah, blah over 45 hands, right? So it's a really different world, and people can believe you about that read without thinking you're making it up or are full of shit, but at the same time, they shouldn't try and make that read in their games, right? It's a very specific thing.
I mean, they should try, but they need to do it properly where they're not eliminating other hands for the sake of making it easier for them.
Yeah.
Like, you've got to start from, like, this is the time you start from the top and go down, and you got to do it the other way around rather than the bottom up.
Totally. So coming back to this backer then, like, how's he feeling at this point then?
So I go all in, the guy folds, I kind of flick up my cards to the reg next to me because I'm just like, fuck, can you believe what I just did? And like, because obviously they're going to be like, fuck, this guy doesn't give a fuck about the money, he's fucking here to play. Even the regs, to a certain extent, are going to think that too, which makes me tougher to play against regs, so I enjoyed that too.
Yeah.
But then someone goes, show one, show them all, so I kind of have to show my hand, and my back was at the table.
Yeah.
And he was furious.
Really?
He was like, yeah, they were like, they didn't drop me because of that, or didn't not buy action, but they were just like on the warpath to not have any more of my action after that. They were like, we want you to play like low variance, and I'm like, well,
I mean,
they were having this argument about like, well, what's low variance? Because I think the play is winning money. Like low variance is like, say I'm winning X amount of BBs jamming this river.
Yeah.
In my opinion, like checking is 0, right? So that's more like, is that more variance or less variance?
It's more in the long term, right? There's a big difference between short and long term variance, right? And if you lower your win rate, you increase long term variance. So why would we?
Exactly.
If we're analytical,
that was my argument. But talking to like live regs who don't quite get that argument, it was tough. They just see big pot, big bluff, should have done that. Like just have a good hand, and I'm like, well, I didn't, and I think the guy was going to fold, and I'm not going to play how I think is good because that's what got me here. Like I didn't get to these limits by like not playing well. I played as well as I could. That's what I'm doing at every stake. I'm just going, this is how I think I should play poker. If I have to adjust afterwards, I will.
Yeah.
Like, but, you know, first of all, confirmation bias, it fucking worked. So chill out. But then I played a not as big pot, but made a mistake probably versus in a different game. And I still won overall, obviously, in Macau. This just happened to be a losing session. And then after that, they were like, right, that's it, you're done. I was like, okay.
It's insane. Yeah.
But that is probably a combination of them being underrolled to get the action.
Yeah, they're just not comfortable with the swings. I get that with students a lot. They'll say, lower, plus it's lower variance. And I'll just be like, well, that's just noise. That's just air. That doesn't have anything to do with how you should be thinking. It's weird how people are choosing a profession that involves so much risk, yet they want to be as risk adverse as possible. That's kind of like paradoxical, right? It's going to shoot yourself in the foot if you do that. Final thing I want to talk about, we've touched on this a few times, but I haven't quite been able to ask the question about it. HUDs, like, where is online poker going? Like, many sites are kind of getting rid of HUDs, right? Like, they're not as big a thing as they were like in 2012, where everyone was like, yeah, you need to have 8,000 stats on your HUD, blah blah blah, and data mine 8 million hands. So now that HUDs are kind of not that great, people aren't really teaching people how to use HUDs. Coaching's not really about HUDs so much anymore. Do you think your students are better off with or without HUDs, and what are some of the ways that they're actually, you know, misusing HUDs and costing themselves EV?
Yeah, so I think HUDs are massively misused. I use a HUD, but I don't use it to analyze my opponents. I use it to analyze myself and try and make my stats look as hard to play against as possible. And I actually think that's a really powerful thing to use with a HUD. And I do that a lot off table, or I used to. I still do that with my students, and I teach them how to do it. As for using a HUD in game, like there's going to be, I'd say when I'm streaming, there's probably been, let's say I've streamed like 200 hours. There's probably been like 4 spots where I wish I had my HUD. And that's over like 200,000 hands.
Yep.
And that's in for like, oh man, I wish I knew how often this guy was cold 4 betting, because like people do that a little bit differently based on what they think.
Totally,
like,
yeah.
Jam here or may not jam based on the stat, but I guess I'm just going to fold because I don't know the number. But that over those many hands is super, super rare. Yeah, maybe I could be taking advantage of it more. But then the biggest way that you see people misapply them, let's say someone's got a really high 3-bet stat. So they're like, okay, I'm gonna 4-bet this guy a lot because he 3-bets a lot.
Yeah. And
I'm like, well, that actually isn't a thing, because it doesn't matter that he's 3-betting a lot if you're going to start 4-betting him a lot, because it matters what he does versus the 4-bet. So for example, if he 3-bets you 20% and he then 5-bet jams 100%, your 4-bet's burning money every time you bluff, because he's going to jam on you every single time. So you're trying to look at the first stat, but really realistically, if he 3-bets you 1% but folds 100%, somehow if that's possible, then you should 4-bet him every single time.
Yep.
So that's a really common way of people misusing it. I also think that people use it to justify doing certain things. And I think that not using your HUD makes you use your brain more, which is definitely going to be really key, especially when you want to. I feel like making money at poker these days is more about getting as good as you can online and then moving to live. And live, you need your brain. And you need to recognize when that guy's opening too much, not because you see his VPIP high, but because you see him playing a hand that's like, all right, he's open Jack 9 off under the gun. This guy's VPIP's too high. Pretty simple, right? You need to spot that stuff. I mean, that's a really obvious one, but you need to spot this stuff and you need to notice this stuff without needing a HUD. And then that's pretty much it for me on HUDs. I don't really use it in game, but more because I'm training to play live. I can see the merit of them, but I think people over rely on them and use them wrong. But using HUDs to like improve your own stats, I think is pretty cool. Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, I think people are very quick to be like, oh, this guy's got a high C-bet stat, so I raised. And it's like, well, you raised a hand that's like a massive deviation in GTO to raise. Like you raised like a hand that really shouldn't ever raise on this turn unless you have like the sickest, weirdest read in the world. And then let's look at your sample, and they have 411 hands on somebody. And it's like, well, how often did the guy face that node over 411 hands? Most of those 411 hands, he folded 7-3 off on the hijack. That's what he was doing for those 411 hands. So I actually said to a student last night, he was like, oh no, my HUD's not ready. My HUD isn't loading on this other table. I was like, dude, see, if you just disabled your HUD for a couple of months, you'd become much better at cards. Like, you don't use that very well. Nobody uses it well, though, because no one teaches them how to use it. Yeah. All right. Anything else you want to add? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think that, especially micros, like, you just play better without a HUD. Like, just don't use it. Like, if you can't spot the whales, like, just, you'll have a labeling system that spots whales anyway, because you'll assume this, you can label them. Like, your HUD isn't telling you that. And that's kind of what's more important than HUD anyway.
To me, the HUD tells me, like, at a glance, who the regs are and who they aren't. So if a guy is like 21-12 over like a few hundred hands, he's probably a weaker player. If he's 44-20, he's almost certainly a weaker player. That's all you need to know. You don't yet know from that what kind of weaker player he is, what his post-flop tendencies are. You just know that you want to play more pots with that guy. So for me, the HUD is like a magnet. It draws me to playing more hands against some players and playing more solid against others, and that's really it. I stop at like a very vague differentiation, just shading the player, basically. That's all.
That's pretty much what I do.
Yeah. So for people who want to know more about your streams and your content, where can they check you out?
I'm GingePoker and everything. GingePoker Twitch, GingePoker YouTube, GingePoker Instagram, GingePoker Twitter. Soon to be GingePoker Facebook, GingePoker Discord, GingePoker.com. Everything GingePoker.
That's good. Consistency is key in branding. I've got way too many carrot variants and carrot corners and carrot pokers and shit like that. So good job on that front. I'm jealous that I didn't brand everything as one word like that. Listen,
I got good advice for the start. I didn't do that at first. I was like, I think my first Twitch name was like Ginge881991, which is my birthday. They were like, how the fuck are we supposed to know all these numbers? And I'm like, well, it kind of linked because that's what my Instagram is. And they're like, well, just change your Instagram. I'm like, oh, okay. Guess GingePoker's not taken. Sick. All right, GingePoker everyone.
Sweet. My girlfriend has like this email address that she still uses, and it's like one of the ones you make when you're like 19 or something, and it has like hyphens and twos all over the place and all these numbers and shit like that. I'm just like, one day, like, you will look back on that. Yeah, and you'll be like, shit, that's really embarrassing. It's like my first email address was Pasta Blink and then some numbers, because I love Blink 182. My nickname at school was Pasta, right? And that was my email address. And I used to like send CVs off to fucking Marks and Spencer's looking for a summer job with that email address and shit. It's hilarious, but we digress. Thank you so much, Richard Ginge, for coming on the show. It's been great having you.
Thanks for having me.
I think it's been really insightful. And best of luck for all of your online and live poker exploits. Hopefully things start up more seriously again soon and you can get back to those games.
Cheers. You too. Hope everything goes well.
Take care, man. All right, guys. You can check me out on carrotcorner.com. We'll be back with another episode in a week's time. Every Monday we are releasing these. You can follow them on YouTube for some video if you're listening to this. YouTube. My handle there is Carrot Corner. And Twitch. I am building my Twitch channel just like Ginge is doing. I'm a little bit less far along the road than he is, but you can check out my Twitch channel as well, which is Carrot_Corner on Twitch. Give me a follow, give me a sub. Let's build the channel. We'll be playing a lot of cash games on there. Till next time, this has been P. Clark. Take care, guys. Bye for now.